So before we take a deep dive into painting a whole new paint medium, let's start by looking at the very basics of how acrylic paint works, because it's quite different to watercolor. Acrylic paint is generally more opaque than watercolor, and while it can sometimes be mixed with water for transparency, generally it's used straight as it is, straight out of the tube with a damp brush. It's a medium we can also layer colors and mediums into to create a physical texture with. Secondly, you won't be painting acrylics on paper. The best surface for acrylic paint is on a primed canvas or a canvas board. In my videos coming up within the masterclass, you'll see me using quite large canvases like this, and you should feel free to use much smaller canvases like these if you're still gaining confidence with this medium. I'm also painting most of the lessons as fashion illustration, but for your versions, if drawing is something that you're still learning, you might like to do yours as dresses only on a pretty gold coat hanger or on a mannequin. The reason that I suggest this is because the face is often the trickiest part of both drawing and painting on canvas, so feel free to avoid it. So let's get started with the very basics of how acrylics work. So for our first square here, it is all about blending. So I've simply put out 3 different colors that I like, straight from the tube, and we're literally just going to practice blending those 3 colors within this little spot here that I've marked out with masking tape. So sometimes we use this masking tape technique in watercolor, and we can use it in acrylic paint too. So let's start here with just a blob of paint of pink, and then I'm going to pick up this peach tone, and then finally the purple. And I'm going to start with the purple here, and we're just going to blend that out. And my brush is just slightly damp. And this is really just to see how acrylic paint works, and you'll notice that it is a lot more opaque than watercolor. The brush is just picking up a little bit of that coral color that we're now moving into. And this kind of technique can be really used as a background for a bigger piece. And it's quite lovely when you take off the masking tape at the end and reveal beautiful blended colors, or it could be quite nice just on its own. So for this middle square here, we're going to look at a very similar technique to watercolor, which is wet on wet. So I'm going to take some clear water here, and because my canvas is facing up, I'm not going to put too much. You can do this technique a little bit better when the canvas is flat, but you'll still be able to see the technique. So I'm just painting on some very clear water. And then I have some magenta acrylic paint here, straight out of the tube. And if I pick that up and paint it in, you can see how transparent the paint goes. You can even kind of dab it in and see that it will mix a little bit like watercolor, but it'll never spread quite as much. Just adding a little bit more here, you can see the difference of painting onto the dry surface. So that is our wet on wet technique, and the result is fairly similar to looking at using a gloss gel medium, but we'll get to that in this lower square. So for this next square, we're going to look at impasto versus flow medium. So basically, we're going to put out the same amount of paint in this lilac shade, and on the first side, we're going to add something called impasto medium. This is basically a thickening agent, which will give your paint a really beautiful texture and a thickness, and it will almost look a little bit 3D on the canvas. So I'm taking, with a palette knife, about the same amount, equal parts that I have of paint, and I'm just going to mix that in. And this really shouldn't change the color of the paint. It really shouldn't go too much lighter. It'll be virtually the same shade, but thicker. And it's a little bit easier to mix with a palette knife rather than with a brush. And you tend to not lose paint by doing that as well, because you can just scrape it all off. For this section, we're going to use something else called a flow medium, and you can find this in several different brands. And basically, if we add this in, and then this one I'm going to mix up with a brush. To wet that first. This will basically thin the paint out, so it's the total opposite to the Impasto medium. Again, the color shouldn't change. It'll just be a thinner texture to paint with, and it sometimes gives you a little bit more time to paint as well. It doesn't dry quite as fast as paint from the tube. So let's start with the thinner lilac paint with the flow medium. If we paint that out, you can see that the paint is almost transparent. And it almost looks a little bit like watercolor, but it's less likely to drip down your canvas like watery paint, and it will stay wet for a little bit longer. So now let's move to a different brush and try out the same color paint with the Impasto texture. So I'm just painting that on, and you can just see it's exactly the same paint from the tube, but it looks so different with the Impasto texture mixed in. And when it dries, it will actually have that 3D textural quality that's really beautiful. If you're painting something that has a texture in real life, it's a really good technique to use that for. And you can always let that dry and layer over it again and get double the texture, and just keep adding to it with layers. So for our fourth square now, we're going to look at one of my favorite techniques called dry brush. So I've got a dry brush, and I've just put out some of this coral colored paint straight from the tube, and I'm picking it up here, and you literally just start with that loaded brush, and you'll get that drier look as you fan it out, as the paint leaves the brush and gives you this beautiful texture. So you can do all sorts of things with a dry brush technique. It's a really beautiful technique for hair, for a flowing dress with a really large brush. You can use it for so many different things. You can see it's very easy to do. All you have to remember is a really dry brush and paint straight from the tube. So now for our fifth square, let's look at regular acrylic paint versus acrylic with a gloss gel medium. So I have this raspberry colored paint, and just putting out two versions of it, the same size. And for one side, I'm going to mix it in with this gloss gel medium. What this will do is just give a really beautiful texture. It works really well with a satin or a silk finish, or even a beautiful water that's glistening in the light. And we're just going to mix that in, and I'll show you how it looks. So this one will lighten the color a little bit. Again, I'm using a palette knife so that I don't lose any of my paint, as you tend to with a brush if you mix with a brush. So I'm going to start out with this gloss gel medium. And hopefully there you can just see how silky and satiny this finish is. And you can push into it and make it a little bit more transparent if you like. And just to contrast with just that same color without any medium in it, you can see how much more opaque the color is, and it won't dry with that same glossy finish. So something you might like to do is paint out, for example, a beautiful dress like this with the gloss finish, and then you could go in and add in little details around the dress in more of an opaque version of the exact same color, and that will be a very subtle way to give some definition to the dress. And then our very last square is using an old-fashioned sea sponge, which you may have tried out at school, and it's still a lovely thing to try out techniques of texture, whether that's in trees or dresses. Anything that has a speckledy texture will look wonderful using this. So let's try it out, first of all, in a lighter color, and I'm just going to mix up a pink tone here with some coral and white. And I might actually leave a little bit of that darker coral in there, which the sea sponge will also pick up. So I've got my sponge here and it's just slightly damp. It's not really wet and it's not dry. It's just lightly damp. We're just going to pick it up and dab it in. So you can see how this would work really well for a tree in a more natural color. I tend to use something like this more for a dress, and it might be like a beautiful feather around the neck, or it might be the very bottom of a skirt that you just want to kind of fan out rather than paint actual brush strokes of. And then you could pick up another color and add it in there, and even a darker color at the top that you might just graduate down a little bit, and you can move your sponge around to a spot that doesn't have any paint, that's just damp, and soften the little bits where you might have put too much darker color. So for now, I would love you to draw up a similar small canvas like this one, marking out the squares like I have, and try out all of these techniques. You can keep the little canvas as a reference for future pieces. If you don't have the additional mediums at hand right now, just leave those spots blank for when you do. And I'll see you in the next lesson.